The World Skeptics Congress, Paranormal, Supernatural, Fringe Science, Pseudoscience, and How It Really Is. Berlin welcomes you.
Our next lecturer is Kylie Sturgess. In spite of the long distance between our homes, I used to meet her every week because she has a brilliant podcast, Token Skeptic. I think now she released episode 119 or something like that. So tokenskeptic.org, I guess. She is writing editorials on the CSICOP webpage, and she's an award-winning psychology teacher with more than 10 years experience in education. And she has lectured on teaching critical thinking and anomalistic belief worldwide. So let's hear her lecture on why can't a teacher be more like a scientist? Pseudoscience in education.
Petard, I think, is possibly the other way that we can say it. I am a former high school teacher and a university tutor, strangely enough, at the beginning of this year, for about maybe 12 years in schools in Perth, Western Australia. In fact, this year I'm going back to being a university student, and later this year I'll return to tutoring in a theology department at a Catholic university. I have a very strange life. Although I'm a former high school teacher, one of the things about my career is that I find I'm always talking about education everywhere I go. I may have left my job as a high school teacher, but I never seem to leave my job. On the Wednesday when I arrived in Berlin, I was having lunch with Josephine and some other great people from the Nottingham Skeptics, Andy and Steph. And after we went to the Natural History Museum, you can see us there, we started talking about teaching over lunch. It's just one of those things I always seem to do because I'm interested in other people's experience of education, like how they view the future of young people. What are their own goals when it comes to furthering their own education? We were talking about how we observe science standards dropping, and this is something Samantha Stein will be talking about after my talk, and about how content on what used to be A-level type exams turning up on current O-level exams in the UK. We shared experiences about university students having difficulty writing reports and tutors having to add more and more instructions to assessments to make sure that the students understand what's being asked of them. Now, these kinds of conversations always make me think about how I generally feel that education is becoming more of a challenge. And despite progresses in technology and despite many opportunities that are open to learners of all ages, many of the concerns that we talked about were ones that many of you might share in some form or another. For example, violence, young people, and what can education do to help? This is a recent news article about the UK riots in 2011, a 2012 report by an independent group set up by the UK government suggested, amongst many other points, that schools should demonstrate how they are building pupils' characters with fines if schools fail to meet literacy standards. Violence, of course, isn't just through riots, but can occur in smaller and still just as distressing situations like bullying and behavioural problems. And there's always questions as to whether resources are being put to good use when it comes to dealing with them. For example, in Australia, they implemented a chaplaincy system in 2007. This was implemented for the spiritual and emotional well-being of the school community, general pastoral care and counselling for students and staff, values education, special needs mentoring, amongst other things. Now, this is now brought into question whether it's contravening Section 116 of the Australian Constitution about not imposing any religious observance upon its citizens. There are protests against standardised testing worldwide, such as in the USA and in Australia, due to it being flawed, preventing other learning, and just being a waste of time. Even entire systems of a country in terms of education being criticised. Recently, California has taken steps, as other states have done, to remove their schools from the No Child Left Behind Act in the USA. Now, we already had a morning program that looked at the controversy resulting from the international spread of creationist literature, so I probably don't need to go over that again. And certainly how structural factors in schools contribute to this, which were brought to us by Eugenie Scott and Dietmar Graf. There's also a talk after mine by Samantha Stein, where she'll be talking about disengagement from science and the impact that this is having on science literacy. All of these are clearly important factors as well, and I'm glad they're continuing to be raised at conferences like this one. I also found an interesting coincidence that Eugenie talked about national science standards being worked upon and next generation being set in the USA. In Australia at the moment, we are moving into a national curriculum, and there's been a call for people to give feedback on what is known as the ACARA documents. And I think that clearly before a document is finalised in education, feedback and consultation should be given. So I think it's good that skeptics in particular learn about and act ahead of time about on these documents before they become too late to talk about. Now, at this point, rather than a depressing, unsinkable rubber duck of problems, I'd rather present you with a sloth in a bathtub that can sink in order to cheer you up. Because, well, are things that bad? This talk isn't meant to be about seeing the situation facing schools and facing educators as hopeless, as I'm certain that many of you think that there's a lot that worldwide communities can do. And sceptical groups, specifically as many of us have access to great resources and know who to network with in order to help educators. As a part of the accountability movement worldwide, schools are expected to provide interventions that provide measurable improvements in learning outcomes and are based on sound scientific research. So what to do? My first degree after I began teaching was a Master's in Special Learning Needs. And so I did a little study. My focus was not so much on these specific learning needs, but I did have a look at them as part of my studies, was the additional challenges faced by learners who have conditions like dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, Asperger's, and other learning difficulties. It's not just families who are lured in by miracle cures to help out their children. Teachers, entire education systems can be too. What I have here are some very basic overviews of some of these learning difficulties that some of the pseudoscientific claims are meant to help out with. And these face learners of all ages, not just a child as demonstrated here. Some conditions like dyslexia will influence us for our whole life after all. And for me, these are some good examples of areas of need when it comes to challenging pseudoscience in education. Commercial programs can claim to improve pedagogical practices and promote efficient learning in an almost miraculous manner, and these can be very misleading and sometimes damaging. This talk's title was inspired by a paper I discovered in 2008, at the time I probably first became a skeptical activist. And this paper investigated how teachers access good teaching resources. And the paper suggested an alternative model for evaluating efficacy of educational programs that would be more like a sliding scale of levels of acceptable programs. Teachers, like any other professionals out there, look for resources and look for help online. We talk to peers and talk to colleagues. We follow the standards that are dictated by the system. And as you've already heard from several of the speeches already, developing a skeptical mindset is not an easy thing to do. As you can see there, what the research they demonstrated back in 2008 said that we find colleagues' workshops and in-service training programs more accessible and certainly more applicable than professional journals. Governments should certainly ensure that educational policy is determined by the best available scientific evidence. That's a big hope sometimes. And they suggest a level 1 to 5, bad to good, when evaluating programs. And they were looking at the warehouse clearing program that was online. Okay, as I'll now show you, investigating claims in education is an area that skeptics have already done a lot of research in over many years, and we've disseminated information in a variety of ways. In my opinion, we've adapted to new technologies brilliantly, and we use social media networking extremely well. I've already started following the Twitter stream to see how well we've been doing this morning, for example. Challenging pseudoscientific practices in education is an area of need that I think we should continue to contribute to, and certainly start to have more focused networks upon. It's also something, as Carter and Weldor have pointed out, it helps out educational practices in general. Their paper was written in 2008, and now in 2012, some of the rubber ducks that they mentioned are still turning up. Dore, brain gym, facilitated communication are still getting attention by parents and communities in general. Now, some of the information I'm presenting in slides, like this one here, are very, very recent. In fact, some of the slides show examples of news items that happened this week. In fact, I think one only happened 3 or 4 days ago, which is rather distressing when you think about how articles from, like, for example, the CSICOP website challenged facilitated communication back in the early 2000s. Here's one. Dr. Simon Singh, Edzard Ernst, David Colquhoun, Andy Lewis of Quackometer, and a number of members on the British Humanist Association have written into the Observer expressing concern about pseudoscientific free schools, namely the Maharishi and Steiner schools. Now, I hadn't heard of the Maharishi schools before. They teach a system of herbal medicine, which, as the article says, lacks in both efficacy and safety. There's also been a very lengthy investigation, a great investigation, conducted by Andre Sebastiani, I hope I'm saying your name right, in last year's German Skeptiker magazine that I highly recommend for German readers. In the May-June 2012 edition of the Skeptical Inquirer, Dr. Steve Novella wrote about an effort in my country by Friends of Science in Medicine, where over 400 professional members protested complementary and alternative medicine being taught at the university level. What I did find a little odd about the Friends of Science and Medicine group, and I asked this of one of their representatives in a podcast interview, why only the already graduated professionals who were being allowed to sign the petition? Why not get the students of the university involved? I'm certain that, like today, there would be college students like myself who would be more than willing to say, I don't want to be going to a university that promotes pseudoscience. How about the larger community? Families who are paying taxes to these universities or putting their children through university, believing that the students are going to get a degree that's worth the money they paid for. Now, this leads into interrogating the title of my talk, which admittedly has a certain amount of bias in terms of why aren't the teachers more scientific? And we've already had lectures already about how influential teachers are. Do we blame them? Do we blame the heads and the administrations of schools? Well, it's not that simple. It's a great number of stakeholders out there who I think we should hold accountable and at least consider that they play a very important part in terms of pseudoscientific practices being occurring in classes, not just universities, but high schools and primary schools as well. When we look at what helps students learn, as well as tackle special learning needs that they have in schools, there's a few elements that help with early successful intervention. Timing is crucial. We all know that when a student is facing a problem, spotting it first and spotting it early is a great help. Intensive instruction, direct provision by trained professionals, and realising not every student is the same when it comes to a problem. Acknowledgement that the environment that one child is raised in is not going to be exactly the same as another. And a school can be inclusive and often is legally required to be inclusive of children's differences. That way, I would use maybe an intensive reading program that I might have used in the inner city Anglican school in my home at Perth. I would use it differently because if I was at a different school, such as the Australian Islamic College, where my students were Somali refugees. Now, as I said, skeptical communities are, I think, doing a good job on keeping an eye on what claims are out there. One way is to look at the products that are being promoted with the consumer rights approach. The most recent Skeptic magazine, for example, has a fantastic overview of about maybe 5 pages on a number of sensory integration therapies. And the article finishes with what I think is this very pertinent quote by Grace T. Baranek, which I think sums up the consumer protection approach. Pseudoscience in general wastes not only time but money. And the same can be said with controversial practices that claim to treat children with autism, spectrum disorders, and functional behavioural problems. Now, of course, there's a number of flaws that we can see in practices and products that are being sold in terms of being pseudoscientific. We're looking for absence of control groups. They're beyond the population it's being used upon. Subjective data is significant. We want these products to work, so of course we believe in them and we hope they will, and to us They seem to. I've come across practitioners from the company Dore who, even as their company was going bankrupt, they still kept saying that they trusted their employers and wanted to continue working because they thought the method worked, even as they were being locked out of the building that they were working in. The influence of maturing over time has an influence on how well you develop your skills, and it makes conditions change. Shouldn't a product recognise that? And of course, other methods and interventions that may have an effect on the participant and might be attributed to a pseudoscientific practice. We can't easily say that all practitioners and practices are coming from one generic background. Do we blame Mozart for creating music in the first place when there's a claim that listening to his music improves brain capacity? Or do we alienate mothers and call them terrible things because they want to help their children improve their brain capacity? Does that really help? Not everyone who takes part in a pseudoscientific practice are going to be the same kinds of people either. Adults take part in the Dore program. I've had teenagers try Baroque music to help them study, a sort of a different version of the Mozart music therapy. And some learning may be social or emotional based rather than about improving your intellectual abilities, although I doubt that improving your sex life results from abstinence-only education, quite frankly. There's a great number of practices out there, but I would like to, for this talk, just focus on 3 that I think demonstrates examples of people being proactive and taking a variety of approaches to challenge them. I could make a tremendous list there, and if you want some, I certainly can provide you with some. But the last 3 are the ones that I think I'll look at today. What is Brain Gym? Brain Gym is an educational movement-based program which uses simple movements to integrate the whole brain, senses and body, preparing the person with the physical skills they need to learn effectively. It can be used to improve a wide range of learning, attention and behaviour skills. Educational kinesiology and Brain Gym are the results of many years of research into learning and brain function by an educationalist, Dr. Paul Dennison, PhD, from the United States. I hope that translates across cultures. Now, there's a number of claims that they make, such as re-educating the mind and body, that to make what would result in learning any skill more efficient and easy. As you can see, a very basic diagram in regards to what parts of the brain are used for what and how they can be trained. The purpose is to get the participant ready to learn using perceptual motor training activities such as stretching, crawling, bouncing balls, walking on balance beams. Apparently, Dennison included yawning after he became convinced that purposeful yawning improved his eyesight. I'm certain if you tell your optometrists, they'll have a good laugh too. A paper by Hyatt in 2007 pointed out that the advocates of Brain Gym haven't followed through on the advice of the American Academy of Pediatrics in terms of publishing their research results in peer-reviewed journals. And they've appeared to base the majority of their claims on testimonial evidence and research so flawed that it's basically meaningless. I'm on Twitter, and on 20th of April 2012, I decided just randomly to type in Brain Gym. This is what I found. Tom Hartley is a scientist. He is also a parent. And his school was introducing Brain Gym. And he needed a resource. And the only thing he could find was maybe 4 or 5 blog posts by Ben Goldacre. I'm not sure if many of you read Dr. Ben Goldacre's site Bad Science, but he can sometimes get a bit verbose and very detailed. I can say this because both he and I come from the same town. So I can say what I like. And so when Tom Hartley was looking for a resource, maybe a sheet that could be presented to his school, to the principal, to say, we really shouldn't be bringing in this into the school, he found it very difficult. And I immediately fired off to him saying, hi, what can I do? How can I help? Let's see if we can get this happening. And he said, yes, whatever you're doing, see if you can pull something together in terms of a resource so I'm not the only parent out there facing this. He did take in papers. Because he was a scientist, he was able to access scientific journals and get out printouts. There's a few, such as Hyatt's paper, which says Brain Gym is not efficacious. And he was able to convince the principal not to bring it into his school where his children were going. But there's probably a great many parents out there who aren't on Twitter who aren't scientists, who can't download a journal and would have a difficult time trying to find, well, how do I tell my teacher? How do I tell my children's infancy class? That brain gym just doesn't seem to be doing what it promises. This is an oldie, certainly not a goodie, and it's still going on. Time, June 2011, as you can see down there. During the 1970s, Rosemary Crossley from Melbourne, Australia, was interested in teaching literacy skills to non-verbal individuals, primarily children with cerebral palsy who needed some form of communication because their problems with manual dexterity prevented the use of sign language. According to her, facilitated communication was discovered accidentally when she used arm and hand support to assist Anne MacDonald, a 16-year-old with cerebral palsy, in gaining control over her movements. By steadying her, she claimed that she facilitated Anne in selecting letters or pictures, teaching manual selection skills. Crossley's account of the work that she did with MacDonald was included in the UNESCO report of 1995 on overcoming obstacles to the integration of disabled people. She developed a centre called DEAL, which stands for Dignity Through Education and Language. However, questions about the authorship of the messages made its way to the courts, and they were initially ruled as authored by the clients, not the facilitators. And then this was reversed on subsequent evidence. By 1992, Crossley moved to the United States and influenced Syracuse University, where Professor Bicklin had investigated it as a professor of special education and took it on. The qualitative methodology that was used produced ambiguous and vague results, but it was continued to be promoted as maybe the participants were unwilling or they were tired or a great number of reasons. A facilitator could even be allowed to interrupt if the participant was making inappropriate responses. Yeah. Of course, many of us know about the abuse charges which were revisited in that Time article of 2011. There was also a frontline documentary which looked at facilitated communication, which I believe you can still find online. Now, my own experiences in the late 1980s, I was taught this book as non-fiction when I was a high school student. A film was released in 1984, Annie's Coming Out, which won 3 Australian Film Institute Awards for Best Film, Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Lead Actress, and won a prize at the Montreal World Film Festival. It's been taught across Australia. Here's an example of an HSC exam paper, the New South Wales Standards, where, as you can see, in terms of write about 2 contemporary issues, read the examination paper and decide what you'll talk about. One of the books under personal relationships is Annie's Coming Out. And I would not be surprised if the book is still being used in high schools occasionally in Australia, even though it's quite an old text. In 2011, the Department of Human Services banned Dr. Crossley from taking one of the profoundly disabled friends of Annie, Leonie McFarlane, to a conference due to the wishes of McFarlane's parents. 3 days ago, she was in the newspaper defending criticism coming from the family of Annie MacDonald. Her brother was finally speaking to the media saying, "The story that Annie MacDonald said in a book does not gel with the experience that I had growing up with her." Facilitated communication, she claims, rests on a sound scientific footing. The largest American and Italian research studies found clear evidence validating the facilitated communication of more than 70 people. Dore. This is the one I've been hesitating talking about because they are litigious. In 2006, 5 editorial board members resigned from the journal Dyslexia to protest the publication of an article on the effects of a treatment that claimed to cure dyslexia. The company was Dore Achievement Centres. The company was founded by multi-millionaire Winfred Dore in 2002 and cited these papers from the journal Dyslexia to promote the treatment, and even now he continues to do so. And yes, you can see the comment up there in quote marks. That's my comment on it. Key elements of the Dore program include balance boards, throwing, catching beanbags, stretching, coordination exercises, individually tailored and it costs thousands of dollars. For example, 14 months gets you $5,000 of treatment. They don't just claim it's for dyslexia either. It's helpful for ADHD, dyspraxia and Asperger's syndrome. They've been criticised as severely flawed by a number of researchers, and issues include the fact that they're very litigious when they're questioned, especially by the media. One of the great people who speak out against Dore is Dr. Ben Goldacre. And my own experience with Dore, that might give you a clue about how I feel with it. I first bumped into one of their stalls at the Mind, Body, Spirit Festival in Melbourne. It's a pro-paranormal, psychic fair. When I bumped into the Dore stand, all I could do was say, "Oh my God, you're Dore." And the woman started being very friendly, and she gave me a DVD. And I fled down to the other end of the centre, straight into the Amnesty International booth. So when Joanne Bruckman talked about talking to people who believe, I'm not a good example of talking to people who believe. I fled. It was due to that experience that I started networking with a number of other bloggers, and they're best known online by names such as Quackometer, Gimpy, Brainduck, and we started to track the claims of Dore. Unfortunately, this video doesn't work, but if you look at the Convention on Modern Liberty, around about the 11-minute mark, Ben Goldacre talks about the efforts that we took to question Dore and how we started to document the eventual administration and bankruptcy of the company when it started to collapse in Australia, New Zealand and USA. Unfortunately, they have found their legs and they still are in existence. That's the article that he wrote about us, The Guardian, 31st of May. We blew the whistle, and not only did we notice and spread the news about the administration, we lent support to parents who were suddenly realising that the buildings were shut and that they had spent thousands of dollars just the other day and suddenly there were no treatments. As Ben Goldacre would probably say, in an ideal world, we will be teaching children enough science in school they were able to stand up to a teacher who's spouting this kind of rubbish.
Well, maybe it's my own bias, but I think that's a little tough on teachers.
Often I hear the excuse of the closed door of education. You might not know what the teachers are doing, but you can see the trends and you can keep an eye out. A professor I know who works in the field of psychology mentioned something that I'm certain Tomasz Wiskowski, who's going to be speaking tomorrow, about the creep of pseudoscience in psychology teaching. You can spot it out there. In addition, as Eugenie Scott said this morning, where you have school boards, you have politicisation. Citizens holding signs at a school board meeting could just as easily be advocates for science, not just advocates for creationism, global warming, denialism and so forth. She said, get out and vote, and I think that's an excellent example of being proactive. We can publicise protests, new research, use the media that we have out there, lend support to those in need, just looking on Twitter, looking online. And parents are seeking to find out more, and many teachers are parents themselves. Consumers are losing money and teachers are wanting to upskill and train. And some of these practices seem to be giving them a great deal. Finally, I would suggest looking outside the sceptical communities and into traditional activists and consumer rights advocates, even books, for example, like Mark Henderson's The Geek Manifesto. I interviewed him for my podcast back when he was first starting to pull together the book after going to QED Con in 2011. And I think what he says here is relevant to us, particularly after the success of the recent libel reform campaign. We must lobby our elected representatives. Take time to explain how and why evidence matters. Geeks are constitutions too. We have a right to expect politicians to listen to us, even if they won't always agree. When governments hold public consultations, we must participate. When they don't, we have to share our views anyway. It doesn't always work, but many are open to persuasion. And it's something that I think we should continue with pseudoscience in education too. Continue to question and continue to speak out. If you're interested in finding out more articles on this particular topic, I highly recommend the Skeptical Inquirer website, and some of the articles on there by searching for things like facilitated communication, Dore. There's a massive backlog of articles there. The UK Skeptic, Skeptica magazine, and skeptic.com. And of course, Bad Science by Dr. Ben Goldacre. JREF are creating teaching resources. I think we should probably start looking at teaching resources that aren't so good and recommending against them, as well as providing good models. My own site, tokenskeptic.org. I blog at Free Thought Blogs. I'm on Facebook because I'm such an internet nerd. There is an article on randy.org which summarises basically the talk that I've given here today. So if you head to randy.org, you'll see it under the heading of Pseudoscience in Education. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you
Kylie raised a lot of skeptic topics, I guess, so I hope that you will have some comments on that.
Hi. Is it safe to assume that if someone is promoting this miracle cure for some sort of, developmental disorder, and they are a company, that they're probably talking bullshit?
Not all the time. I gave the example of a person who I found online when Dore was starting to go into administration, and one of the Dore forums had people saying, okay, the company's shut, I've gone down. There was one person who was an employee of Dore, and they were devastated. They said, but I know that we're helping these children. I'm employed by them. I trust them and so forth. They were absolutely, completely genuine in the belief that they were doing the right thing by these kids, and that they had, children that they believed were doing wonderfully. And they were incredibly disappointed to discover this. And yeah, it's the same with telling a parent, if they're taking part in brain gym, you do have to start realising that turning around and telling someone that they're stupid and taking on these things, it isn't always necessarily the best approach. And sometimes I know it's difficult to step back from that position of the knee-jerk reaction of, oh my God, as I just demonstrated. But yeah, you do have to start thinking to yourself, they are human beings too. And we too can quite easily fall for anything that's out there. Hopefully not. I'm skeptically crossing my fingers. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
The World Skeptics Congress, Paranormal, Supernatural, Fringe Science, Pseudoscience, and How It Really Is.
We're skeptically interrogating